And this is an article starting on page 22 entitled Warren G. Harding and the Forgotten Depression of 1920. I would like to quote several brief paragraphs from this article because there is an important lesson contained therein. The economic situation in 1920 was grim. By that year, unemployment had jumped from 4% to nearly 12%. The gross national product had declined 17%. But in November of that year, Warren G. Harding was elected President of the United States. The article continued. In his 1920 speech accepting the Republican presidential nomination, Harding declared, "We shall strike at government borrowing which enlarged the evil, and we will attack the very high cost of government with every energy. We promise to attend to the halting of waste and extravagance. It will be an example to stimulate thrift and economy in private life." President Harding cut the government's budget nearly in half between 1920 and 1922. Tax rates were slashed for all income groups. The national debt was reduced by 1/3. And by the late summer of 1921, just a few months after he was elected, signs of recovery were already visible. The following year, unemployment was back down to 6.7% and was only 2.4% by 1923. However, not all of the news was good. The Depression of 1920 bankrupted 5,400 banks. And we've got to ask the question, who bought all of the bankrupt banks at a reduced price? Could it be those who planned the crisis? One of the little-known stories of the 1920 Depression was the fact that one of the targets of the planners was the automobile maker Henry Ford. Despite the inflation of the 1920s, Ford ordered a price cut for his automobiles. But demand was still insufficient, and a number of Ford plants had to be shut down. Rumor had it that a huge loan was being negotiated. But Ford, who thought the bankers were nothing short of vultures, was determined not to fall into their hands. Bankers lined up to offer their help in return for his surrender of independence. When large corporations borrow money from the big bankers, the bankers make certain that their officers sit on the board of directors of the borrowing company. They want to make certain the loan is not squandered by the unwise decisions of the company's officers. And it is the board of directors, meaning the bankers, who run the business. This is what Mr. Ford feared. Now back to the discussion of Mr. Ford. The game was clear to him. One representative of a Morgan-controlled bank came forward with the plan to save Ford. Ford saved his company by turning to his dealers, to whom he now shipped his cars in spite of the slowness of the market. Ford sent his cars to the dealers without cost to the dealer. Until they sold the car, then they would have to pay for it. Demand grew, and the plants were reopened. Ford had outsmarted the bankers who had planned the Depression, in part to force him into borrowing money to keep his Ford Motor Company in business. He didn't succumb to the pressure, and he saved his business. Well done, Henry Ford. Let me now return to the Depression of 1920. Notice this. These actions taken by President Harding solved the Depression in about a year, maybe two. But as of July 2011, America is in a recession not as severe as a depression. And President Barack Obama is doing exactly the opposite of what President Harding did. And there's no relief of the recession. In nearly 2.5 years, the end of the recession even isn't foreseeable in the near future. One can only wonder why President Obama is not following the successful record of President Harding, and the answer is obvious. Barack Obama does not want to end the recession, and the reason Barack Obama does not want to end the recession is because the Federal Reserve does not want him to. This recession is all about debauching the currency for the reasons detailed by John Maynard Keynes. Now let me proceed with a brief discussion of the crash of 1929, where billions were lost in a new stock market crash. When I was researching my book in the mid-1980s, I'm not quite that old yet, mid-1980s, I looked for explanations as to what might have caused the crash of 1929. I found this book, amongst others, entitled The Great Crash 1929 by John Kenneth Galbraith, and I read it. Mr. Galbraith was described as a Keynesian, meaning Mr. Keynes was his hero, and that he, meaning Galbraith, was a leading proponent of 20th century political liberalism. He served in the administrations of President Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, all of whom were also leading proponents of 20th century political liberalism. And these are his conclusions about the cause of the great crash of 1929 from pages 432 and 172. No, I shouldn't be laughing. This is one of our great economists saying this, so this obviously must be a truth. No one was responsible for the great crash. There was none who caused it. Although I got to give him credit, he does admit this. The Federal Reserve Board was a body of startling incompetence. So no one caused it, but whatever caused it, the Federal Reserve Board was incompetent to prevent it and then stop it. But Galbraith did agree with his hero, John Maynard Keynes, who wrote this in a quotation I read earlier. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. In other words, some people benefit from crashes. This is how Mr. Galbraith put it. The man with the smart money, who was safely out of the market when the first crash came, meaning the beginning of the crash, naturally went in to buy or to pick up bargains. In other words, those with the smart money who got out of the stock market before the crash started went back in and bought bargains, meaning stocks at a much lower price. Of course, naturally. When I was in my economics courses, I asked my professors, who told us all about the selling of these stocks in the crash in 1929, just who was it who was doing all the buying. We spent time discussing the sellers of the stock, but we never discussed who was doing all of the buying. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that for every stock sold, someone bought it. Both of the two economists, Keynes and Galbraith, told us that the people with the smart money, those who got out of the market before the crash happened, went in and naturally bought every stock sold. Maybe, just maybe, that was why the Federal Reserve Board was startlingly incompetent. It was to allow the people with the smart money to come back in and buy stocks at a dramatically lower price. After the crash in 1929, the ownership of the banking system had changed. About 16,000 banks, or 52% of the total, went out of business. Today, 100 out of 14,100 banks control 50% of the nation's banking assets. 14 big banks have 25% of the deposits. Could it be that certain large banks somehow had extra cash set aside so that after the crash was over they could purchase bank assets at a reduced price? And that was an additional reason that the Reserve Board was startlingly incompetent. The depositors in all of these old banks were impoverished, but someone else was enriched. You know something? I believe Mr. Galbraith did know what caused the crash and that he intentionally lied. Don't forget, he was a, quote, a proponent of 20th century political liberalism. Just what would you expect him to say? The stock market crash was planned by the Federal Reserve? I somehow don't think he would say that. But I want to make it clear. I found the evidence that the Federal Reserve did plan both of these depressions, and I provided that evidence in far more detail in my book. And I would like to now briefly discuss the evidence that the Depression of 1929 was the result of the planning by the Reserve Board. First of all, I'm going to round the figures I will present just to make it a little easier to understand. It all started after the Depression of 1920. The Federal Reserve had $34 billion of money in circulation of June of 1920, and they decreased it to $32 billion in June of 1921, and they started increasing it to $33 billion in June of 1922, to $36 billion in 1923, to $38 billion in 1924, to $42 billion in 1925, to $43 billion in 1926, to $45 billion in 1927, and then to a high of $46 billion in June of 1928. The Federal Reserve then leveled it off to the same $46 billion in June of 1929. They had increased the money supply by 44% from June of 1921 to June of 1929. Now this is how the media contributed to the Depression of 1929. They were convincing the public to invest in the stock market where you could become as rich as John D. Rockefeller, perhaps this nation's wealthiest businessman. This was what they were doing with the extra money that they had increased the money supply by. So you heard that you buy stocks with the assistance of a stockbroker, so you call and make an appointment. You tell him that you have $100 that you want to invest in purchasing stock, and you want to buy one share of Epperson popsicle stick makers. You tell the broker that I recommended this company because it was an Epperson who invented the popsicle, and by the way, that story's true. And you want to share in the good fortunes of the Epperson family. The stockbroker then explains that stock market tycoons such as yourself have to get familiar with the language. Tycoons always refer to a stock by the first two words of the name, so you call your stock Epperson Popsicle. He goes on to explain how the system works. You invest $100 in Epperson Popsicle, and if the stock goes up just 10% to $110, you'll make a 10% profit. And you start thinking how easy this is. And then you, you reassure yourself by thinking that this must be how John D. Rockefeller made his fortune, by starting small.